Hi everyone, welcome to this first lecture for our Eating Well class. Please make sure that you have looked over the syllabus for this course and that you are following the instructions in each weekly module. If you have questions at any point, please feel free to email me anytime. And otherwise, I hope you enjoy this course and I look forward to interacting with you all a bit through the discussion boards. All right, so our first lecture is just a really basic overview, very basic overview to nutrition. And in particular, this lecture will cover recommendations around a healthful diet, a healthful way of eating. As we go throughout the next 4 weeks, this course is roughly a mini nutrition course. So each of the subsequent weeks will look into other aspects of the science of nutrition. So we'll start with a basic definition. What is nutrition? And I want to provide two definitions here. So on a very basic level, nutrition is the process of providing or obtaining the food that is necessary for growth and for health. Sort of synonyms might be food or nourishment is often maybe a more colloquial word used to imply the same thing as nutrition. And from a more scientific perspective, nutrition is a branch of science, and in particular, it is a science that looks at nutrient needs and total system nutrition. I think it's also worth giving definition to this word nutrient. A nutrient is specifically some component of a food that provides nourishment and is essential for growth and the maintenance of life. So a nutrient by definition is something that the body requires, something the body needs, and effectively something that is health promoting for the body. In that regard, then, anything that takes away from health or deters health wouldn't be considered a nutrient. So I think this is kind of the quintessential question is, what do we eat? What should we eat? And so I want to go through some of the ways that over the span of human evolution and much more acutely in the dawn of nutrition science, which has only been around for maybe 150 years, kind of look through all of the pieces, all of the ways that we accumulate information and knowledge about how to eat well, how to nourish our bodies. So the first part is definitely just evolution. Humans have been on this planet for millennia, and obviously many hundreds of thousands of years ago, we learned what to eat and what not to eat because certain things were poisonous and other things were not poisonous. So that was a very rudimentary way of learning, okay, this is actually toxic to the body quite literally, and this plant over here is not toxic to the body. So just the growth and the evolution of humans over the past hundreds of millions of years. And then, of course, more recently, like I said, in the last 150 years or so that nutrition science has been around, we have science and research that helps us learn about, at a much more intricate level, how food and the body interact, and how foods can become health promoting and growth promoting within the body. And then in a much more simplistic way, we just have guidelines, we have recommendations. And these guidelines can come from health professionals, they can come from nutrition professionals, dietitians, they can come from public health experts, they can come from medical professionals. And then we also have guidelines that come to us through our government and also through some international organizations. Oftentimes the government recommendations are, of course, well, at least we hope, are influenced by the latest science and the latest research. and are backed by nutrition experts and public health experts. In the United States, we do have dietary recommendations, and then if you look around the world, and this is part of what I ask you to do for your discussion for this week, you'll find that countries around the world have also their own national dietary guidelines. And there are a lot of similarities, perhaps surprisingly, and also perhaps not so surprisingly. There are a lot of basic similarities that exist country to country, region to region throughout the world. And then, of course, there are some pretty interesting differences depending on the part of the world in which that country is located. So in this lecture, we're going to look a bit at the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans, because that is the government recommendation for us here in the United States. So the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, I don't actually know off the top of my head when these started. I want to say back in the 1970s, the first Dietary Guidelines for Americans were published. And that's actually kind of a fun exercise too, if you're interested, is to go back and look at the Dietary Guidelines for Americans over the past 50 years now and see how they've evolved, see how they've changed, see how in some ways they've circled back to things that they said originally, but maybe came away from. At this point, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans are updated every 5 years. And so 2020 is the year for the next most recent update. But currently we're still working with the guidelines that were published in 2015 to be used from 2015 through 2020. All right, so what are the basic 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines? So the next 5 bullets are the 5 key components of the guidelines for this edition of the dietary guidelines. So the first is to follow a healthy eating pattern across the lifespan. Eating patterns are the combination of foods and drinks that a person eats over time. So my interpretation of that is to say, in general, follow a healthy eating pattern over the course of one's life. Obviously, there will be some deviations, and not every single thing that crosses our lips will be healthy or the healthiest. But in general, like the total sum of what you eat over your lifespan ought to be healthy, even if some of it, a little bit of it, week by week, year over year, isn't the healthiest. Focus on variety, focus on nutrient-dense foods, and focus on amount. So paying attention to these things too. I do think variety is one of the most important components of a healthful eating pattern. No matter what the actual food is that we're eating, variety is really quite critical, and we'll look more at that next week when we get into different nutrients. Nutrient density is also an important term if you were to take a nutrition course. This is a really important term, and it just indicates the amount of micronutrients, vitamins and minerals that are present in the food per calorie. And so something that is very nutrient dense provides a good variety of different nutrients and fairly decent amounts of those nutrients at the expense of having very few or relatively few calories. So nutrient dense foods typically are fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables provide very few calories, and they tend to have the highest concentration of different vitamins and minerals of any of our food groups. And then amount, of course, is just paying attention to how much we're eating. And for some people, being mindful of also not eating too little. So it's very much balanced. There's very much a sweet spot in terms of eating well. Limit calories from added sugars, saturated fats, and reduce sodium intake. Pretty straightforward from the outset. And this type of information can be gleaned from looking at nutrition fact panels, which we'll get at a little bit later. So being mindful of the added sugars in a food and trying to consume fewer added sugars and or fewer foods that contain added sugars. An added sugar is something where sugar was added into the food, like, a cookie is a perfect example. First of all, a cookie doesn't just naturally exist. We have to make it. And when we make it, we put sugar into it to make the cookie. As a different example, blueberries, for example, or an apple, they naturally contain sugar, but we humans didn't put sugar into it. So the apple or the blueberry has naturally occurring sugars, which is different from added sugars. Also limit calories from saturated fat. Again, something that's more easily determined by looking at the nutrition facts panel. Otherwise, we don't necessarily know how much saturated fat is in a food. And same goes with sodium. We can use the nutrition facts panel to be mindful of our sodium intake. Shift to healthier food and beverage choices overall. So again, similar to the first one, just in general, moving towards healthier choices, both in our food and in our drink. And then support healthy eating patterns for all. A little bit vague at the end there. All right, so what does a healthy eating pattern look like? This is just pulled from the USDA website. I might have skipped over that on the last slide, sorry. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans are jointly written by both the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So those are the two branches of our federal government that convene every 5 years to update their recommendations for a healthful eating pattern or a healthy diet. So this is their definition, and when I say their, I mean the Department of Ag and the Department of Health and Human Services. This is their definition of healthy eating pattern. So a healthy eating pattern includes a variety of vegetables, dark green, red, orange, beans, peas, and starchy and other vegetables. It includes fruits, especially whole fruits. It includes grains, and at least half of those grains are whole grains. It includes fat-free or low-fat dairy, including milk, yogurt, cheese, and or fortified soy beverages. It includes a variety of protein foods, including seafood, lean meats and poultry, eggs, legumes, which again are peas and beans, soy products, and nuts and seeds. So again, already twice we see the word variety. And then oils, including those from plants, canola, corn, olive, peanut, safflower, soybean, and sunflower. And then also knowing that oils are already present in foods like nuts, seeds, seafood, olives, and avocados. So if we consume these foods, we don't necessarily have to consume the oil, the added oil. And then this is the website where this information is pulled from. So if you're interested in reading more, you can click that link and learn more. This is the icon or the infographic that is used again to represent the current dietary guidelines for Americans from 2015 to 2020. Again, if you do go back, or if you're about 30 or older, you might remember some of the previous icons or infographics for the earlier renditions of the dietary guidelines. Back in the 90s, it was a pyramid. I think that was one of the early, well, no, it wasn't the earliest image that they had, but I would say maybe it was the earliest cohesive image, because prior to that it was like individual groups. And in the 90s they developed the pyramid, and then the pyramid evolved in the early 2000s to be like a multicolored pyramid with pillars that ran top to bottom. And then I want to say around 2010 they evolved from the pyramid to the plate. So this is just the visual representation of how to put together a healthy meal. So roughly half the plate should be composed of fruits and vegetables. Only a quarter of the plate should be consumed by protein foods. And again, like I said, a variety of protein foods, and including things like beans, soy products, nuts and seeds. A quarter of the plate should be from grain foods, and at least 50% of the time that we're eating grains, those grains should be whole grain. And then there's the spot for dairy. This little bit just goes over how much, and how much is actually a pretty tough question to answer, believe it or not. Largely because each person is so different and each person lives such a different lifestyle, even within a single family or within a single household. Everybody has very different dietary needs. So these are just baseline recommendations for your average person who might be consuming 2,000 calories a day. And to be quite honest, your average female who's doing the minimum recommendations for physical activity wouldn't even need 2,000 calories a day. And most males, if they're not exercising, would hardly even need 2,000 calories a day. So this is sort of interesting because this number has been around for decades, 2,000 calories a day. But our lifestyles have changed pretty drastically, even in just the last 50 years, where we're much more sedentary. And so by being more sedentary, we're using fewer calories, we're using less energy throughout the day, which means we need to consume less energy throughout the day to stay in good equilibrium or balance or homeostasis within our bodies. Nonetheless, let's look at what these recommendations are for a 2,000 calorie diet. 2 cups a day of fruit, 2.5 cups a day of vegetables, 6 ounces of grains, which is, by weight it would vary, but if you were going to measure it in a cup, or if you were going to translate that to a cup, that's actually just shy, that would be maybe 3/4 of a cup. 5.5 ounces of protein per day. I think this is a really worthwhile one to point out because in the United States, you go to any standard restaurant, you're getting 8 ounces of some sort of animal flesh. So already that singular meal puts you over your protein requirement for the day. And then the dairy, 3 cups a day. And then here at the bottom, they give you the recommendations for limiting sodium, no more than 2,300 milligrams a day. And for folks who already have hypertension or who have any sort of cardiovascular issues, even less than that, closer to like 1,500 milligrams a day is a good target. Limiting saturated fat and limiting added sugars to 50 grams a day. This is actually excessive. This one is very excessive. I'm just noticing that actually. The recommendation I give for added sugars is actually to keep it under 24 grams a day, which is half that recommendation. And then be active your way, so at least 60 minutes every day for children every day, and for adults at least 2.5 hours per week of activity. So of course activity isn't necessarily diet based, but obviously activity and diet kind of balance each other. And then this is just another way to look at serving sizes. This comes from the University of California at Berkeley, and you can see, oh, I see what this is. This is serving sizes. So the previous page was telling us how much to eat throughout the day. And if you wanted to break that apart into different meals, you could say, okay, let's have, a fruit, 1/2 cup of a fruit is a serving. Similarly, 1/2 cup of a vegetable is a serving. For grains, they say 1 ounce equivalent is a serving. So that might look like a cup of cereal, a 1/2 cup of cooked rice or other grain, 1 slice of bread. Protein, 1 serving is a 1 ounce equivalent. So if we remember on the previous slide, 5.5 ounces roughly was the recommendation per day. So then you could have obviously 5 servings of protein if they were each only 1 ounce. Dairy, the serving is 1 cup, serving size is 1 cup, and then oils, spreads, and dressings. Usually about a teaspoon is a serving, but these aren't, oil, spreads, and dressings were not necessarily, they're not necessarily recommended as a food group by the USDA, so these would be kind of the additions, and probably be mindful not to have much more than 1 serving of each of these per day. And then in the middle, you'll see the number of servings to equal what we saw in that previous slide. So to get 2 cups of fruit a day, it would technically be 4 servings. To get 2.5 cups of vegetables per day would technically be 5 servings. To get 6 ounces of grains per day would technically be 6 servings, etc., etc. I'll just point out here, I think this is really interesting. A lot of folks tend to be hung up on, I don't even remember when this was, maybe the late 90s, early 2000s. There was the whole Strive for 5, which was another sort of marketing term from the USDA in terms of getting folks to eat 5 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. Well, now, here in 2020, this, obviously, if we add that, that's 9 servings a day combined fruits and vegetables. So the Strive for 5 is a kind of old news. If you're not there yet, definitely try to get there. But if you are there, you can still improve. You can still eat more healthfully by actually striving for 9 or even more. There's currently no upper limit recommendation to fruit and vegetable intake, whereas these other categories, especially grains, protein, and dairy, do have upper limit. Well, I shouldn't say they have upper limits, but they have more immediate health consequences and lasting health consequences if we overeat these other food groups. Whereas fruits and vegetables, we don't really suffer any consequences if we overeat them, apart from potentially going to the bathroom more frequently. Alrighty, so I want to spend a couple slides just comparing these recommendations briefly to a couple other sources of healthful eating recommendations. So, alrighty, sorry, I just kind of messed up my PowerPoint a little bit. So I think if I said anything, I know I might have erased some things that I just said, but I think I know what I erased. So hopefully this flows a little bit seamlessly. So one of the first comparisons I want to draw is to Canada's food recommendations. So we'll just go through these really quickly, and we're just going to look at this much more briefly than what we just looked at for the US. So Canada recommends making it a habit to eat a variety of healthy foods every day. Eat plenty of vegetables and fruits, whole grain foods, and protein foods. Choose protein foods that come from plants more often. Choose foods with healthy fats instead of saturated fats. Limit highly processed foods, and if you choose to eat these foods, eat them less often and in smaller amounts. Prepare meals and snacks using ingredients that have little to no added sodium, added sugars, or saturated fat. Choose healthier menu options when eating out. Make water your drink of choice. Replace sugary drinks with water. Use food labels, and be mindful that food marketing can and does influence your food choices. And then if you want to read more about Canada's food recommendations, you can click the link at the bottom there. So real quick, let's kind of breeze back through these and point out some of the major or most obvious differences to the US guidelines. I think the first one, Canada is recommending eating a variety of healthy food every day. The US makes it much more vague and says over the lifetime, eat a healthy diet. I think the second bullet point points out choose protein foods that come from plants more often. The US government certainly is not making that recommendation, although in my professional opinion they should. They, again, are much more vague to say eat a variety of protein foods, and then they go on to list the different sources of protein foods. So this one is much more straightforward. Limiting some of these unhealthy foods like saturated fat or unhealthy ingredients. And then also making a point to limit processed foods. This is a little different too from the United States. Or the US government doesn't go into as much detail to say limit processed foods, especially highly processed foods. The sodium, sugar, and saturated fat is a similar recommendation, although maybe a little bit more clear here. Canada makes a comment on eating out, eating meals at restaurants. These next 2 bullet points I think are pretty very interesting and very important, that Canada is recommending water as the beverage of choice, and in particular encouraging their citizens to replace sugary drinks with water. The United States says nothing about water. And then the last two are just getting a little bit more to the environment that we live in and recognizing that we are constantly being marketed to from food companies. And these food companies, their bottom line is dollars, not our health. So their goal is to always sell us more product, they don't necessarily care if we're healthy or not healthy, as long as we keep coming back and eating their product. And then also encouraging their citizens to use the food labels as a guide to making healthful choices. It's also different. And then this is Canada's infographic, which I also think is pretty fascinating. I've actually started to use this in my private practice or in my clinical practice, working with folks. I like it in particular because it has actual foods in the pictures rather than just colored triangles. So again, you can kind of get the sense for all the variety that they're recommending. You see that water is the beverage of choice. Milk does not have its own place. And in fact, they've kind of included the protein, they've included the dairy here in the protein foods. So considering it not to be a category unto itself, but actually considering it to be part of the protein group. That is a pretty important distinction from the United States. And then you can see there's a great variety of plant protein options here. There's tofu, there's different types of beans, there's some seeds down here, nuts up here. And then you can see how small these portions of animal flesh and egg and dairy are. Again, just really important and I think really helpful visuals for folks as they're starting to make some healthier dietary shifts. And then I also want to compare it to Harvard's Healthy Eating Plate. And for your discussion for week 1, I asked you to dig a little deeper into Harvard's Healthy Eating Plate and use this as your basis for comparison. In my clinical work as a nutritionist, I tend to reference the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate the most. And to be frank, I don't actually use the Dietary Guidelines for Americans because I don't, I think that I think Harvard gives more deliberate specific information than the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And it's pretty similar to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans with a few key differences, which we'll point out here. So if we look at this infographic, you'll see this is pretty much the same as what the USDA plate looked like. Half the plate is fruits and vegetables, a quarter of it is for the protein foods, and it has a very similar recommendation: choose fish, poultry, beans, and nuts. Although they do make the distinction to limit red meat and cheese and to straight up avoid bacon, cold cuts, and other processed meats. Whole grain similarly gets a quarter of the plate, and they don't necessarily say make half your grains whole, but they just encourage to eat a variety of whole grains and to limit refined grains, anything that is white rice or white flour based. Harvard also adds the oils section and gives some, at least on the plate, the US Dietary Guidelines did make mention of healthy oils, but they didn't include it on the plate. And then again, just like Canada, Harvard recommends water as the beverage of choice. And Harvard actually recommends limiting dairy consumption to 1 or 2 servings a day, whereas the US government is encouraging 3 glasses a day. So another really important distinction. And then, yeah, otherwise fairly similar. And again, if you want more information here, you can click the link at the bottom. And I do ask you to thumb through this link pretty extensively for your reading for this week. So you'll get a pretty good overview of Harvard's healthy eating recommendations. And then this is just what you'll do for your discussion for this week. And there's more complete instructions on Blackboard. Okay, so then this is just our last slide for this lecture, just kind of a summary. 4 key components of a healthy diet. And I should specify too, unfortunately I don't have it written into the lecture, but I want to give definition to diet, because diet is a word that's been around for a long time and you've probably heard me use it a lot in the last 30 minutes. But the word diet originally just meant the foods that a people eats or that a person eats. And so diet never originally meant restriction or low calorie or trying to lose weight. It just literally meant this is my diet. This is the way that I eat. And so you'll notice the U.S. dietary guidelines. So the word diet is in there again. It just means it's not guidelines for weight loss. It's just guidelines for healthful eating. You notice Canada called it Canada's Food Guide, so they didn't even use the word diet, probably because it's a confusing word now. And Harvard just calls it the healthy eating plate. And then even back to the United States, they referred to healthy eating patterns. So I don't know if I'm old school or what, but I actually really like the word diet, and I like to use it for the purpose of meaning the foods that a people eats, or the foods that a person eats. So I just want to make that distinction. Of course, diet does now, in more modern time or more recent years, have the secondary meaning of caloric restriction, reducing intake for the purposes of weight loss or for the purposes of a specific medical condition. So that is also an appropriate secondary definition. And I just want to make the distinction that in this course, I generally use the word diet to just refer to the way a person eats. So basically to say healthy, not necessarily healthy, but just the eating patterns of a person. Okay, so the 4 key components of a healthy diet, we've already seen some of these. Balance is one of them. This didn't necessarily come across in the previous slides, but balance just means to say, have a little bit of everything. Don't necessarily overdo in any one area. If you do overdo in one area, rein it in afterwards. Kind of reduce in that area for a little bit and just find balance. The body is a very complex and intricate system, and the body works really well when everything is kind of in equilibrium or in balance. So I think that's a really important concept to remember in life and also in nutrition. Variety we definitely saw, so eat a variety of different food groups, eat a variety of different foods within each food group, try to eat a variety throughout the day, definitely throughout the year, and definitely throughout your lifetime, eat a variety of different foods. Moderation is of course key, and these all go hand in hand. I could draw this as a Venn diagram as well, but moderation is to say, eat enough but not too much, and eat enough of each food group but not too much of any one food group, and not too much of any one kind of food. And then adequacy, so do eat enough. Again, it comes back to balance and equilibrium. We can overeat, but we can also undereat, and neither scenario would lead us to our optimal health. So adequacy, eating enough, is just as important as moderating. So these are not necessarily nationally recognized, but typically any nutrition professional is going to recognize these 4 components as being true in any healthy dietary pattern, no matter what it is, no matter how a person, what specific foods a person is choosing to eat. If it's a healthy diet, these 4 components are going to be present. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Thanks.